The conclave of voices had not seen a human in 11 years. That alone should have made Ambassador Sarah Voss's arrival unremarkable, a curiosity, perhaps a footnote in the session logs. Humans had withdrawn from galactic politics quietly, methodically, the way they did most things that hurt them. No dramatic announcements. No final speeches. They simply stopped coming, and the galaxy, after a brief and uncomfortable silence, moved on. So when the request arrived, a single transmission, text only, no encryption layer, no diplomatic preamble, the conclave's administrative body flagged it as a potential error. The Human Confederacy requests one final session before the conclave. Agenda: the matter of the Lethean corridor. Duration requested: 2 hours. Ambassador Sarah Voss. We ask only that you listen. Facilitator Orvain, a Dacic whose memory spanned for centuries of sessions, read the message 3 times. Then he called an emergency procedural meeting, which was itself unusual, because the Dacic considered urgency a form of poor planning. They said final, noted Secretary Polhari, a young Vrethian whose iridescent skin flickered with something close to nerves. That word. Final. I noticed, Orvain said. Do you think they mean, I think we should let them speak? He set the message down. We owe them that much. Most of the conclave disagreed. Several member states had actively lobbied against allowing the session. The Keth Dominion sent a formal objection. The Moravian Collective abstained, which for them was essentially agreement. Even some of the neutral parties questioned the value of reopening a conversation that had closed with such pain on both sides. But Orvain had 4 centuries of memory, and what he remembered most clearly was the moment 11 years ago when humanity's last ambassador, a thin, exhausted man named Cortez, had placed a single data chip on the table and said, "You'll understand eventually," and then walked out. They still hadn't opened the chip. It sat in the archive room, logged and sealed, and nobody had ever given a satisfying reason why. Sarah Voss arrived without a delegation. That was the first thing the security officers noticed. She had no aides, no legal counsel, no protective detail. She carried one bag, the kind a person might pack for a weekend trip, not for a mission that might determine the survival of a civilization. She was younger than they expected, mid-30s, maybe, with the kind of face that had clearly been through something it hadn't fully finished processing. Dark circles, steady hands. She smiled at the security team when they scanned her, and it was a real smile, not a diplomatic one, the kind that reached the eyes even when everything else looked tired. I've never actually been here before, she said, looking up at the conclave's vaulted atrium. The structure was designed to humble, all-sweeping geometry and layered light, built to make every visitor feel appropriately small. It's beautiful. The security officer, a Dacic junior staffer named Warren who had never dealt with a human before, processed the comment and found it unexpectedly disarming. He had been briefed to expect aggression, or desperation, or performance. He had not been briefed for genuine appreciation. The Eastern Spires were added 300 years ago, he said, before he could stop himself. Voss looked at him. Really? What's the story behind them? He told her. He wasn't sure why. The session began at the 9th conclave hour, which by human reckoning was late morning. 47 member states were present, represented by their senior diplomats or their automated observation systems. The Keth Dominion's representative, Magistrate Corlin, had positioned himself at the far end of the chamber with the specific posture of someone who intended to be visibly unimpressed. Orvain opened the session with procedural formalities. Voss waited. When Orvain finished, he looked at her across the long table. Ambassador Voss. The floor recognizes the Human Confederacy. She stood. She didn't have notes. She didn't have a presentation display or a preloaded data stream. Thank you, she said. I'll try to keep this honest. Corlin made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. The Lethean corridor, Voss said. I know what you're expecting me to say. That humanity needs the transit route reopened. That the trade restrictions have strangled our recovery. That we're here to negotiate terms. She paused. That's not why I'm here. The chamber was very quiet. 11 years ago, this conclave voted to restrict human access to the Lethean corridor following the Verith Station incident. We appealed that decision. We were denied. We filed 3 separate formal challenges over 4 years. We were denied each time. She said this without visible bitterness, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Eventually, humanity stopped trying to change your minds and withdrew from active participation in the conclave. You interpreted that as acceptance. It wasn't. Corlin leaned forward. If you're here to reopen, I'm here to tell you what's been happening in the Lethean corridor for the past 7 years, Voss said. And I'm here to make you a promise. She reached into her bag and placed a data module on the table. Before I explain, I want to ask the facilitator to retrieve something from the archive. Orvain went very still. The chip. The chip, she confirmed. Orvain retrieved it himself. He had thought about that chip many times over the past 11 years. It had occupied a particular corner of his long memory, not as a mystery exactly, but as an obligation deferred. Something he had not done, and known he had not done, and had not let himself examine too closely. He placed it beside Voss's module on the table. Open it, she said. He did. The chip contained a single file. A report, dense with data, authored by the previous human ambassador, Cortez, dated to the week before his departure. It was titled, with the kind of directness that Orvain was beginning to associate with human communication in general, what we found in the corridor. The chamber read in silence. Automated translation systems rendered it simultaneously across 47 species languages. The reading took 6 minutes. When it finished, the silence was different. Heavier. He knew. Secretary Polhari said softly. Cortez knew. He knew, Voss agreed. He told you. You didn't believe him, and the political cost of reopening the appeal process was considered too high, so the chip went into the archive. She said it without accusation. I understand. Bureaucracies make that calculation constantly. I've made versions of it myself. What the chip described was this: a species in the early stages of a collapse event. Not a military collapse. Not an economic one. Something slower and more complete. A civilization coming apart at the biological level. A cascade failure in their reproductive systems triggered by an industrial contaminant that had been spreading undetected for 3 generations. The species was called the Leth. They lived in the 7 inhabited worlds strung along the Lethean corridor, which was, of course, how the corridor had gotten its name. The trade restriction that locked humanity out of the corridor had also, incidentally, structurally, without anyone intending it, locked the Leth in. Nobody checked, Voss said. In 11 years, nobody sent a survey mission. The corridor is politically complicated. The member states with interests there have been in dispute over navigation rights, and it was easier to leave the restriction in place than to sort out the jurisdiction question. Corlin's voice was careful. We have monitoring systems. That the Leth have been deliberately feeding false data, Voss said. Because they're ashamed. Because they didn't want anyone to know. She looked around the chamber. They're dying. They've been dying for a long time. And the only civilization that knew where to look and had the specific industrial chemistry expertise to synthesize a counteragent was locked out of the corridor 11 years ago. The chamber stayed quiet. How many? Orvain asked. When Cortez filed his report, the Leth population was approximately 4 billion. Current estimates, based on the data we've been collecting through indirect observation since we couldn't go in ourselves, she stopped. Took a breath. Somewhere between 600 million and 900 million. 11 years. The break in session lasted 40 minutes. Voss spent it sitting in a small anteroom, drinking something warm that a Dasik staff member had brought her without being asked. She looked out the narrow window at the conclave's formal gardens, geometric, precise, every plant chosen for symbolic meaning, nothing wild anywhere. Warren appeared in the doorway, the junior security officer who had told her about the eastern spires. Ambassador, he said. Just Voss is fine. He hesitated. The Keth Dominion's delegation has been in private communication since the session paused. I shouldn't tell you that. No, you shouldn't. The Moravian Collective has formally requested a copy of the full data archive. Good. He stood there a moment longer. He was young, she thought. Young enough that the Verith Station incident was history to him, not memory. Why did you come alone, he asked. She considered the question. Because this wasn't a negotiation. You don't bring a team to a negotiation if you're not actually there to negotiate. Then what are you here for? She set down her cup. To make sure someone in that room decides to feel responsible. When the session resumed, Magistrate Corlin spoke first. He was not a cruel being. Voss had read everything available about him before coming. His record, his previous votes, his public statements. He was a political animal, motivated by the specific pressures of his position, genuinely convinced that his decisions served his constituents. He had voted to maintain the corridor restriction 4 times. Each time, his reasoning had been coherent within the framework of Keth Dominion interests. The Confederacy has had this information for 11 years, he said. You chose not to bring it forward. We filed 3 appeals, Voss said. We were denied. And then, yes, we made a decision. We decided to actually solve the problem instead of spending another decade in procedural argument. Corlin's eyes narrowed. Meaning what? Voss opened her module. Data filled the display space above the table. Chemical structures, synthesis pathways, clinical trial results. 18 months after the 3rd denial, she said, the Confederacy established a covert research program. The goal was to develop a counteragent for the Leth contaminant using only the information we could collect without physically entering the corridor. She pointed to the synthesis pathway. This took us 9 years, 6 months, and 11 days. It required the cooperation of 43 separate research institutions across 14 human worlds. We lost 4 researchers to accidents during the development phase. We had 17 failed compound trials. She paused. We have a working counteragent. The chamber erupted. Orvain let it run for a moment. The objections, the questions, the overlapping voices across a dozen species. Then he called for order, and the room slowly settled. You developed a medical intervention for a species you hadn't had physical contact with, said the Vrithian delegate, who was also a biologist. Her tone was not skeptical, it was genuinely awed. Without access to live biological samples. We're not the best at it, Voss said. It took us longer than it should have. The compound has a meaningful margin of effectiveness. We estimate between 70 and 85% response rate, depending on the individual's current stage of exposure. It's not perfect. She stopped. We needed to tell you that. We didn't want to oversell it. There will be Leth who don't respond. There will be population cohorts where we're too late. This isn't a rescue. It's a reduction in damage. 70 to 85%, the Vrithian delegate repeated quietly. For a population of 6 to 900 million remaining. Yes, Corlin said, very carefully. Why are you giving this to us? Voss looked at him for a long moment. Because we can't deliver it without conclave authorization to enter the corridor. The restriction is still in force. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not here to negotiate the corridor restriction. I'm not here to trade you the counteragent in exchange for political concessions. I'm not here to leverage this into a better position for human commercial interests. She held his gaze. I'm here to give you the compound, unconditionally, and ask you to get it to the Leth. That's all. The room was very still again. Unconditionally, Corlin said. Unconditionally. You're not requesting the restriction be lifted. I'm not requesting anything. I told you. This isn't a negotiation. He sat back. Something moved across his expression. Something complex and not entirely comfortable. Then what is it? A promise, she said. Kept. Afterward, Orvain asked her to stay. The formal session had closed. Authorization to enter the corridor had been granted. Not unanimously, but with enough votes to constitute binding action, and even Corlin had eventually, quietly, registered his support. The Vrithian biologist had already begun coordinating with the human research team. There was machinery moving now, and it would take time, but it was moving. Orvain walked with Voss through the conclave's long interior corridor, the one the public never saw, reserved for members, lined with plaques commemorating significant sessions. Decisions that had shaped the history of 100 worlds. Cortez, Orvain said. Did he know you would come? We talked, Voss said. He died 3 years ago. Heart failure. She said it plainly, the way people say things they've had time to make peace with. He wanted to be here. He was very angry for a long time about the chip. About the fact that it just sat there. He had a right to be. He also understood why it happened. She slowed, looking at a plaque near the end of the corridor. He used to say the hardest thing about working with multi-species governance was that everyone was rational. Everyone was making sensible decisions based on their own information and interests and constraints. And somehow all those sensible decisions added up to something catastrophic. She touched the edge of the plaque lightly. He said the only way to break that pattern was to do something irrational. Spending 9 years developing a medical compound for a species you'd never met. using nothing but indirect observation, Orvain said, and then giving it away without conditions. Most political theorists would call that irrational. Most political theorists aren't human. He was quiet for a moment. What does the Confederacy gain from this? She considered the question seriously. He appreciated that she didn't dismiss it or perform offense at it. Honestly, probably nothing immediately measurable. The trade route stays restricted unless the conclave acts on that separately. Our political standing doesn't substantially improve. We don't get resources or recognition or access. She thought about it. We might get the knowledge that the Leth survived. That's something. It's not nothing, Orvain said. No, she agreed. It's not nothing. They reached the end of the corridor. Through the window at the far wall, the conclave gardens were still geometrically perfect, every plant in its designated place. Can I ask you something? Voss said. Yes. The chip. In 11 years, did anyone ever argue for opening it? He was quiet for a long moment. The answer, he knew, would not reflect well on the institution he had served for 4 centuries. But she had come here alone, without leverage, to hand them something they hadn't earned, and honesty seemed like the least he could offer. Once, he said, a junior archivist. First year on staff. She flagged it 3 times through proper channels, and each time it was deprioritized because the corridor question was politically sensitive and reopening it was considered disruptive. He paused. She resigned her position 4 years ago. I don't know what she's doing now. Voss nodded slowly. Tell me her name, she said, and I'll make sure she knows the compound worked. The Lethean corridor was opened 6 weeks later. Not to trade. That would take another 2 years of political negotiation between the member states with competing interests. But for the specific, limited purpose of humanitarian transit, with the human medical vessels as the operating party and a joint conclave oversight team accompanying each mission. The first human ship to enter the corridor in 11 years was a converted research vessel called the Cortez. Sarah Voss wasn't on it. Her role was political, not medical, and she had other sessions to attend, other things to put in motion. But she watched the launch feed from a Confederacy relay station, in a room with 11 other people who had worked on the compound project, most of them still wearing the particular exhausted look of scientists who had just learned their work would actually reach the people it was meant for. The biologist seated next to her, a woman named Dresch who had led the synthesis team and lost 2 of the 4 researchers who died in accidents, was crying. Not loudly, just quietly, the way people cry when they've been holding something for a very long time and can finally let it go. Voss put a hand on her shoulder. They didn't say anything. The Cortez crossed the corridor boundary and disappeared from the relay camera's range, and the room exhaled together. What happened on the Leth worlds over the following 18 months became, eventually, one of those events that historical archives struggle to summarize adequately, because the raw data is significant but fails to capture the texture of what it actually was. The counteragent was effective. Not perfectly, as Voss had told the conclave. Not for everyone, not at every stage. There were communities on the 4th and 6th Leth worlds where the damage had progressed too far, and the medical teams worked through those weeks with the specific grief of people doing everything right and still watching the mathematics come out wrong. But the response rate across the broader population averaged 79%, which meant that of the 800 million Leth who were alive when the Cortez crossed the corridor boundary, somewhere over 600 million had a meaningful chance at recovery. 600 million people who had been monitoring their own population decline for 3 generations, who had watched their birth rates collapse and their cultural institutions quietly restructure themselves around absence, who had fed false data to external monitoring systems not because they were strategically devious, but because admitting the truth felt like something they couldn't survive on top of everything else. 600 million of them were handed a compound that a species they had barely interacted with had spent 9 years building in secret, without being asked, without any expectation of repayment. The Leth did not have a single unified government. They had 12 separate governing bodies acro. SS, 7 worlds, each with their own traditions and protocols. The response to the human medical mission was therefore not coordinated. There was no formal ceremony, no unified diplomatic statement. What there was, the governing body of the first Leth world issued a declaration in their oldest ceremonial language, which translated approximately as the debt that cannot be repaid is still owed. The governing body of the Third World planted a species of tree in every major city, a tree that, in Leth cultural tradition, was reserved for locations of permanent significance. The governing body of the Fifth World, which had the oldest and most damaged population, sent a single transmission to the human research team, a recording of children singing. No translation, no explanation, just the sound. Dresch played that recording at the debrief meeting, and nobody managed to say anything analytical about it for a while. 2 years after the conclave session, Orvain retired from his position as facilitator. He had served for 41 years in the role, and 400 years before that in various subsidiary positions, and he had seen the conclave do remarkable things and terrible things, and most often a complicated mixture of both. He had developed, over that time, a measured view of institutional capacity, what collective decision-making bodies could actually accomplish, and what they inevitably failed at. At his retirement session, he was invited to give a brief address. He spoke for 8 minutes. Afterward, people remembered different things about it, the way people do when someone says something that touches several different nerves at once. But the line that circulated most widely in the years that followed was this: in 4 centuries, I have seen many species demonstrate their intelligence. I have seen fewer demonstrate their character. Intelligence tells you what is possible. Character tells you what is worth doing when no one is making you do it. He didn't say humans. He didn't need to. Sarah Voss was recalled to the Confederacy 2 years after the conclave session. Her diplomatic posting concluded, her work technically complete. She didn't go back into diplomacy immediately. She spent 8 months on a quiet world at the edge of Confederacy space, doing, as far as anyone could tell from external observation, very little. Reading, walking, corresponding with the Leth biologists who had been working alongside the human medical teams and who had, in the way that people sometimes do across enormous cultural differences, become something like colleagues. The junior archivist from the conclave, the one who had flagged the chip 3 times, had, it turned out, become a teacher. Elementary instruction for young Dacic children, a position of no particular political standing, an unremarkable career by most measures. Her name was Thistle. Voss sent her a message. Not an official one, not through diplomatic channels. Just a private correspondence, the kind that has no organizational weight at all. The compound worked. You were right to flag it. I'm sorry it took us all so long. Thistle wrote back 6 weeks later. Dacic communication ran on different rhythms, and it was longer than Voss had expected. 3 full pages. She talked about the years since she'd left the archive, about her students, about what it was like to teach children a history that included the moment they were living through. The children asked me why the humans helped, Thistle wrote. I tell them, because humans find it difficult to know that something terrible is happening and do nothing about it, even when they are not required to act, even when acting costs them something, even when no one will reward them for it. This is unusual in the galaxy. The children think it sounds exhausting. I think it sounds like a promise kept to no one in particular. I think that might be the best kind. On the 7th Leth world, in the largest city, there is now a small plaza. It was built in the 3rd year after the medical mission concluded, in a neighborhood that had lost almost 30% of its population before the counteragent arrived. The plaza is simple. Leth aesthetic tends toward the functional, with a central water feature and benches arranged in a pattern that represents, in Leth symbolic tradition, a circle without end. At the center of the water feature is a single inscription, rendered in Leth script, and in the 47 languages of the conclave member states, and in the 3 most widely spoken languages of the human confederacy. It doesn't name Sarah Voss. It doesn't name Cortez, or Dresch, or any of the 43 institutions, or the 4 researchers who died. It says, in all those languages, they did not know us. They chose us anyway. Voss learned about the plaza from a photograph sent by a Leth biologist she'd been corresponding with, a woman named Koresh who had been on the medical coordination team and who had a habit of sending images without explanation, as though the images spoke for themselves. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she wrote back, "Tell me about the neighborhood." Koresh wrote back with 3 paragraphs about the neighborhood, the families who had come back after relocating during the worst years, the shops that had reopened, the school that had expanded its enrollment for the first time in 2 decades. Then she added, "There is a boy here, 7 years old. His grandmother survived. He does not entirely understand what that means yet, but he knows that something happened, and that people he has never met were part of it. He asked me once if the humans knew they were being brave. I told him I didn't think they thought of it that way. He thought about that for a long time. Then he said, maybe that's what brave is. Voss read that message twice. Then she put her communicator down and went for a long walk, and came back, and sat for a while in the quiet. After a while, she picked up the communicator again and started writing a letter. Not to the Conclave, not to the Confederacy, to Cortez's daughter, who was 12 years old and lived on a colony world at the edge of human space, and who, Voss had heard, through the particular grapevine of people who had worked on the same long project, had been told her father spent years working on something important, but had never been told what. She thought it was time someone told her.